A perfectly scientific dictatorship would probably be the most efficient of all. The rulers would not need to resort to violence. Men and women would grow up loving their servitude, and the system of control would be maintained more by satisfaction than by fear. This is not a sentence written yesterday. It was written more than 60 years ago by Aldous Huxley. This will be the theme of our philosophical excursion today. Let us try to imagine a scene, not a scene from the past, but a possible scene from the future, an ordered, efficient, pacified society. People work, consume, and have fun. Violence is rare. Social conflicts are almost absent. Suffering seems reduced to the bare minimum. Everything seems to work. Everything flows smoothly. And almost no one feels the need to question the order of things. Not because anyone forbids it, but simply because no one feels the desire to anymore. Now the question is this: would such a society truly be free? It is a question that begins to take shape in the 1930s, when an English writer, Aldous Huxley, publishes a novel destined to become one of the most unsettling diagnoses of modernity, Brave New World. In those pages, Huxley imagines a perfectly organized civilization. Individuals are programmed from birth to occupy the place that society has foreseen for them. Society, at least in appearance, is pacified. There are no great existential anxieties, nor excessively deep inner dramas. Every tension is smoothed away, every pain attenuated, every disturbance quickly dissolved by a chemical substance distributed by the state. Soma, the drug of serenity. In one passage of the novel, one of the characters utters words that sound like the founding declaration of that civilization. Universal happiness keeps the wheels turning. Truth and beauty cannot do it. From time to time, someone speaks of freedom, but freedom for what? People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they cannot get. They are secure. They are never ill. They are not afraid of death. They are blissfully ignorant of passion and old age. They are conditioned in such a way that they practically cannot help behaving as they ought to behave. Words that sound almost reassuring. Yet if we think for a moment, something begins to feel unsettling. In the brave new world, no brutal tyranny is at work. There are no prisons, no torture, no systematic repression. Yet something far more subtle and pervasive is at work, because freedom is not suppressed by force. It is simply rendered useless. Many years later, returning to reflect on those pages, Huxley would write a collection of essays in which he tried to explain what had driven him to imagine that future. The book is titled Brave New World Revisited, and in one of the most striking passages of his reflection, we find these words: "A modern dictatorship can be maintained without continuously resorting to violence. Through techniques of propaganda and psychological manipulation, it is possible to profoundly influence public opinion. In a technologically advanced society, these methods can be applied with a precision and power that the dictators of the past could not even have imagined. When this happens, control of the population becomes much easier and much more stable." A passage that almost makes one shudder, because it suggests a paradoxical possibility. The most effective form of domination may not be the one that oppresses individuals, but the one that manages to seduce them. And so the question with which it is worth beginning our philosophical excursion is precisely this: if a society truly managed to offer us pleasure, security, and continuous entertainment, would we still be capable of recognizing the value of freedom? Because propaganda, when it is effective, does not convince people of something. It simply ensures that they desire nothing else. Two prophecies about the future: Huxley and Orwell. When speaking of dystopian political visions, the comparison that emerges almost inevitably is the one between two great writers of the 20th century, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. Both imagined a world in which individual freedom is progressively hollowed out. Both tried to understand what form power might assume in a highly organized, technologically advanced civilization capable of intervening ever more deeply in the lives of human beings. Yet if we place their most celebrated works side by side, Brave New World and 1984, a vertiginous difference emerges between them. In the world imagined by Orwell, Big Brother governs through fear, surveils every gesture, rewrites memory, and punishes every deviation. The individual lives under the constant, implacable, impersonal gaze of the system. Freedom is suffocated by force. In one of the most famous passages of the novel, the ideologist of the regime explains to the protagonist the true nature of power. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of power is power. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is to tear human minds to pieces and put them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever. It is difficult to imagine a bleaker vision of politics. Power here seeks no consent from the dominated. It seeks only domination. Huxley, for his part, suspected that the future might take a different path. Some years after the publication of 1984, he wrote Orwell a now famous letter. In that letter, dated 21 October 1949, he acknowledged the strength of Orwell's vision, but added a consideration worth hearing attentively. I wonder whether the policy of the boot on the face can really be maintained indefinitely. It seems to me that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and satisfying their lust for power, and that these methods will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. The change will be brought about as a result of a felt need for increased efficiency. Infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting G-gape into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. Here the perspective changes radically. No longer a power that crushes by imposing controls and suppressing individual freedoms, but a power that insinuates itself into the folds of the deepest desires and shapes the individual. No longer a regime that prohibits, in its place a system that orients desires, that molds inclinations, that intervenes slowly in the formation of the psyche. If a society manages to teach individuals what to desire, if it manages to establish which pleasures to seek, which dreams to cultivate, which fears to avoid, then control becomes so subtle as to be practically invisible. Precisely this point marks the decisive difference between the two prophecies of the 20th century. Orwell feared a world in which books would be banned. Huxley feared a world in which no one would want to read them anymore. The perfect dictatorship, when men come to love their slavery. When, many years after the publication of Brave New World, Aldous Huxley returned to reflect on his own intuitions, the tone was not that of a writer satisfied with his predictions. It was rather the tone of someone who observes with growing unease the direction taken by modern civilization. These reflections, as mentioned, are collected in Brave New World Revisited, published in 1958. It is not the sequel to the 1932 novel. It is a lucid, almost clinical attempt to understand whether the dystopia imagined in the 1930s is not slowly taking shape in reality. And right in the opening pages appears one of his most famous formulations, a sentence that seems written with the glacial calm of someone who has glimpsed something decisive. In a technologically advanced society, the art of propaganda has reached a level of effectiveness that the tyrants of the past could not even have imagined. Through increasingly refined psychological techniques, it is possible to influence public opinion and guide the behavior of millions of people. When these methods are applied systematically, control of the population can be maintained without continuously resorting to violence. The point here is of an almost disarming simplicity. Repression is costly. Repression generates resistance. Repression creates martyrs. Far more effective is a power that manages to prevent the very desire for rebellion. In the novel, this logic takes an almost symbolic form through a chemical substance distributed to the entire population. Soma does not work like heroin. It does not destroy those who take it. It simply calms, reassures, dissolves anxiety, and returns to the subject a serenity that is artificial, certainly, but perfectly functional within the context in which he or she is placed. In a celebrated passage, one of the system's functionaries describes the function of this substance in words that seem to encapsulate the entire political philosophy of that civilization. Soma, all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like, and come back without so much as a headache or a mythology. Stability was the primal and ultimate need. Stability, hence all this. Half a gram for half a holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous East, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning whence you came to find once more that everything was perfectly in order. It is difficult not to sense beneath this apparent lightness something profoundly disturbing, because happiness in this context does not spring from a transformation of life or of the person's inner world. It springs from a technical management of emotions. Suffering is not understood, it is neutralized. Unease is not interrogated, it is simply anesthetized. A psychoactive pill a day keeps discomfort at bay, and little by little a civilization takes shape in which pain no longer has space to become question, protest, or creative restlessness. It is no longer consciousness that decides how to be in the world. It is chemical balance. It is molecules that speak. Huxley sees far ahead and formulates the question with an almost cruel lucidity. The danger he suggests is not only the possibility that power may control bodies, the real danger is far deeper. Regarding propaganda, the early advocates of universal literacy and a free press envisaged only 2 possibilities. The propaganda might be true, or it might be false. They did not foresee what in fact has happened, above all in our Western capitalist democracies. The development of a vast mass communications industry concerned in the main neither with the true nor the false, but with the unreal, the more or less totally irrelevant. And it is precisely here that the reflection takes on an almost vertiginous dimension. Because a society can be deprived of liberty in many ways, through violence, censorship, fear, certainly. We know this well. The history of the totalitarian regimes of the past century showed it to us plainly. But there exists a way of suppressing freedom that is more insidious and silent, the way that occurs when individuals slowly cease to feel the need to be free. A pill in the morning, scrolling after lunch, a Netflix series in the evening, a sleeping pill at night, a dreamless sleep. The society of permanent distraction. If we read Aldous Huxley's pages attentively, a diagnosis emerges that today sounds strikingly familiar and unsettling. The problem Huxley had foreseen was not only political control, The problem would be the transformation of the mental environment in which individuals live immersed. There is no need to silence critical voices. It is enough to submerge them with a constant flow of information and counter-information. To forbid books, to burn them, as happens in Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451, where firemen have the task of setting libraries ablaze, in the end it is not even necessary. Something far simpler and far more effective will do. Make concentration increasingly difficult. Huxley's prophecy, I mention in passing, finds confirmation today in some rather alarming data. Despite widespread schooling, a growing share of young people and adults reads less and less, and a significant portion of the population does not even reach one book a year. Many libraries lie in a state of neglect. There is no longer any need to burn books, they simply molder. Huxley observes that advanced industrial civilization tends to produce a new psychological condition: permanent stimulation, a continuous current of images, sounds, messages, and desires. For in a technologically advanced society, the effectiveness of propaganda increases enormously when the individual is constantly distracted. The mind, overloaded with information, loses the capacity to reflect. When attention is continually solicited by new stimuli, it becomes increasingly difficult to dwell on a single idea long enough to truly understand it. As you can see, the problem here is not censorship, it is saturation, a phenomenon that several contemporary philosophers, I think for example of Byung-Chul Han, have analyzed with great lucidity. The human mind, exposed without pause to new stimuli, progressively loses its capacity for silence. Without silence, Huxley suggests, thought cannot mature. This intuition becomes still clearer if we return for a moment to the pages of the novel Brave New World. In that imaginary civilization, free time is never truly empty. It is filled with almost obsessive care. Sensory spectacles, games, organized entertainment, ever new diversions. And one of the system's functionaries explains the reason with a disarming candor, paraphrased roughly as follows: "We don't want people to have time to be alone. We don't want anyone to remain too long with their own thoughts. Solitude breeds unease, and unease is dangerous. Better to keep everyone busy, continually stimulated, continually entertained. That way the energy that might become protest disperses itself in pleasure." There is something profoundly revealing in these words. Distraction here is not a side effect of civilization. It is a strategy of stability and control. A society in which attention is continually captured by new stimuli produces individuals who consume a great deal, desire a great deal, and react rapidly, but who rarely stop to interrogate the meaning of what they are doing. And perhaps this is precisely the subtlest point in Huxley's reflection. The problem is not that individuals are oppressed. The problem is that they are constantly busy. Busy watching, busy reacting, busy chasing new pleasures. A civilization that multiplies the means of distraction to infinity risks destroying the very capacity of the human being to be present to himself. And when an individual is no longer capable of remaining in silence with his own thoughts, he becomes far easier to guide. It is here that Huxley's intuition becomes almost vertiginous. It grips the throat. For we know it well. The deepest problem of modernity is not the disappearance of opportunities to inform oneself, to study, to deepen one's knowledge. It is the progressive, inexorable loss of the capacity for attention that renders those opportunities vain. One has bread, but no teeth to chew it. In schools, we observe this phenomenon every day. To address the difficulties of our young people, we multiply educational offerings, teaching hours, extracurricular meetings, more or less immersive pedagogical tools, but quantity cannot substitute quality. 5 hours of dispersion are not worth 1 hour of authentic concentration on a science text, a mathematics problem, a page of literature. And without attention, without that fragile faculty of stopping, listening, and questioning, even freedom risks slowly becoming a concept without experience, a pure abstraction to be celebrated, perhaps out of calendrical duty, in civic rituals increasingly drained of life. The other face of Huxley, freedom, begins in consciousness. At this point, however, a turning point occurs in Aldous Huxley's reflection, one that often surprises those who know him only as the author of Brave New World. For Huxley does not limit himself to diagnosing the pathologies of modern civilization. He also tries to understand where genuine freedom might be born, and to do so, he suddenly shifts his gaze from politics to consciousness. In the 1940s, he published a singular, almost unexpected book for a writer known for his dystopias, The Perennial Philosophy. It is not a systematic treatise. It is rather a great mosaic of spiritual texts drawn from different traditions: Christian mystics, Indian thinkers, Buddhist masters, Western philosophers. The idea that runs through those pages is surprisingly simple. There exists, according to Huxley, a dimension of human consciousness far broader than the one we ordinarily experience. But daily life, with its urgencies, its fears, and its restrictive perceptual habits, continually narrows our gaze. In the book, there appears a passage that Huxley draws from William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist between the 19th and 20th centuries, father of pragmatism and a profound student of the phenomena of consciousness, and which will become one of the most famous intuitions in Huxley's thought. Each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him, and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. The function of the brain and nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by this mass of largely useless and irrelevant knowledge, by shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive or remember at any moment, and leaving only that very small and special selection which is likely to be practically useful. According to this theory, each of us is potentially mind at large, but the function of the brain and nervous system is above all eliminative, not productive. In order to survive, this vaster mind must be filtered through the reducing valve of the brain. It is a fascinating idea. The ordinary mind, the one we use every day to work, organize, and react to stimuli, would not be the apex of consciousness. It would be rather a restricted version adapted to the practical necessities of survival. And it is here that Huxley's reflection assumes an unexpected depth. Because if ordinary consciousness is already so limited, then a civilization that multiplies distractions, stimuli, and mental automatisms risks restricting it still further. In a small book that would exert an enormous influence on the culture of the second half of the 20th century, The Doors of Perception, Huxley describes the experience of a state of expanded perception and draws from it a conclusion that is almost poetic. In order to make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. At this point, the question changes perspective entirely. If power can manipulate societies through the control of desires and distractions, then freedom cannot be born solely from political institutions. It must also be born from a transformation of attention, from the increasingly rare capacity to stop, to truly see, to become present to oneself. Because perhaps, Huxley suggests, the first form of freedom does not consist in doing what we want. It consists in not living entirely asleep. In conclusion, the most silent danger. If we now gather the threads of Aldous Huxley's reflection, a picture emerges that has something profoundly disturbing about it. In the second half of the 20th century, many feared the return of the great totalitarian tyrannies, regimes founded on repression, on uniform thought, on police terror. Those fears were not, and continue not to be, entirely unfounded. Huxley, however, had glimpsed another possibility, a more muffled, insinuating, seductive possibility, and one more difficult even to recognize. A society in which individuals are not oppressed, but gradually anesthetized. Control no longer passes solely through force. It passes through pleasure, through distraction, through the technological management of desires. And precisely in Brave New World Revisited, Huxley develops a reflection that, reread today, seems to speak directly to our era. When the techniques of propaganda and psychological manipulation become sufficiently sophisticated, freedom can be eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, without the majority of individuals being aware of it. In a society dominated by entertainment, propaganda, and compulsive consumption, it becomes much easier to orient collective behavior. The problem is not only political, I would say it is anthropological. Because a civilization that multiplies stimuli, distractions, and pleasures to infinity risks slowly transforming even the way in which individuals inhabit their own minds. And at that point, something curious happens. Freedom continues to be celebrated, continues to be named, continues even to be defended in public discourse. Like democracy, a term so fashionable that it must be continually exported. But it becomes increasingly difficult to make direct experience of it. And perhaps this is precisely the most unsettling point in Huxley's intuition. Freedom does not necessarily disappear when someone forbids it. It can disappear also when individuals slowly cease to feel the need for it, when distraction becomes stronger than the search for truth, when comfort becomes stronger than truth itself, when immediate pleasure becomes stronger than the question of the meaning of life. At that point, no great repressive apparatus is needed any longer. A civilization capable of continually occupying our attention will suffice. Perhaps it is for this reason that the pages of Huxley, written now more than half a century ago, continue to resonate with such particular force. Not because they describe an inevitable future, but because they force us to look at something that is happening within us, here and now. And so the question with which we can leave this philosophical excursion open does not concern only politics or technology or the organization of society. It concerns something at once far simpler and far more difficult. If a world truly managed to offer us security, pleasure, and continuous entertainment, would we still know how to recognize freedom? Or, without realizing it, would we slowly begin to love our servitude?